Hi again, everyone. Now let's talk about Article 1209. It is stated that if the division is impossible, the right of the creditors may be prejudiced only by their collective acts, and the debt can be enforced only by proceeding against all the debtors. If one of the latter should be insolvent, the other shall not be liable for his share. So, ang tinutukoy natin dito sa Article 1209 is what we call joint indivisible obligation. The obligation is joint since the parties involved are merely proportionately liable. The obligation is indivisible since the object or the prestation due is not possible for division. Okay? So, halimbawa, si Joshua ang creditor, and si Harry and si Tristan ay joint debtors. Okay? Now, Harry and Tristan, kailangan nilang magbigay kay Joshua ng isang laptop, sabi natin MacBook Pro. So, since MacBook Pro is indivisible, 'di ba? It cannot be divided into some 'di ba? Now, halimbawa dumating na sa date of delivery. Si Harry lang ang willing mag-comply and si Tristan hindi. The obligation cannot be performed kung kung hindi lahat ng debtors ay willing mag-comply. Ngayon, Harry is not liable for Tristan kasi 'di ba si Tristan hindi siya willing to comply. Hindi na liable si Harry sa sa pagiging incooperative ni Tristan. Okay? Yun yung sinasabi dito sa Article 1209. Yung joint indivisible obligation, mako-comply lang siya once na all debtors are willing to comply. Kung hindi willing lahat, hindi maipe-perform ang sinasabing joint indivisible obligations. Now, joint indivisible obligations. A joint indivisible obligation is, in a sense, somewhat midway between the joint and the solidary obligation. Although it still retains the two fundamental characteristics of the former. Una, no creditor can act in representation of the others. Pangalawa, no debtor can be compelled to answer for the liability of the others. So nga sa example natin kanina, hindi willing si Tristan. However, Harry cannot be held liable para sa party Tristan, para sa share dapat ni Tristan. Okay? Next, let's talk about characteristics ng isang joint and divisible obligations. Number 1, if there are two or more debtors, let's talk about debtors. The fulfillment of or compliance with the obligation requires the concurrence of all the debtors, although each for his own share. So, sinasabi nga natin kanina pa, di ba? Na pag sinabi natin joint and divisible obligations, kailangang mag-comply ng lahat ng joint debtors. Okay? Lahat ng debtors na kailangan nila mag-comply kasi once na hindi willing mag-comply ang isa, hindi maipe-perform ang sinasabing joint and divisible obligations. It is necessary na lahat ng joint debtors ay magko-comply sa sinasabing obligation para maiperform ang obligation. Okay? Next, let's talk about the creditors. If there are two or more creditors, the concurrence or collective act of all the creditors, although each for his own share, is also necessary for the enforcement of the obligation. So, to perform the obligation, kung sakaling two or more creditors naman, all of the joint creditors should receive their own share. So, lahat sila dapat makatanggap. So, halimbawa, ang joint creditors si Joshua tsaka si Andre. Ngayon, ang joint debtors naman, sabi natin, o kaya kahit hindi na joint debtors, halimbawa si Harry na lang. Kaya lang joint creditors dalawa, 'di ba? Si Joshua at saka si Andre. Ngayon, si Harry to perform the obligation, it is needed na siya magbigay siya ng object sa parehas. Dapat makatanggap parehas ng creditors. dapat lahat ng creditors ay makatanggap ng kanilang share or ng object due dun sa obligation na yon. Now, let's talk about effect of breach. If one of the joint debtors fails to comply with this undertaking, the obligation can no longer be fulfilled or performed. So, sinasabi nga natin, kung hindi willing mag-comply yung isa sa mga debtors, kung hindi willing mag-comply, nag-fail to comply, the obligation cannot be performed na. Why? Kasi sa joint indivisible obligations nga, sinasabi nga natin na dapat lahat ng joint debtors ay mag-comply doon sa sinasabi nating obligation para ma-perform or ma-fulfill yung tinatawag na obligation. Next, effect of insolvency of a debtor. If one of the joint debtors should be insolvent, the others shall not be liable for his share. So, tulad nga sa example natin kanina, di ba? Yung kay Harry and kay Tristan. Tristan is not willing to comply. Tristan failed to comply with the obligation. Harry cannot be held liable for that. Di ba? Kahit willing si Harry and si Tristan hindi pwedeng maging liable si Harry para sa obligation, para sa share ng obligation ni Tristan. Next, interruption of period of prescription. Ngayon, merong dalawang views na pinag-uusapan. Una, the right of the creditors may be prejudiced only by their collective acts. It can, therefore, be inferred that should the act of a joint creditor be per se beneficial to the others, as for instance, the interruption of the period of prescription, the act of one would be sufficient. Sinasabi dito na the act of one creditor, halimbawa, may joint creditors, diba? Sinasabi dito sa unang view na the act of one creditor is sufficient na for the interruption of period of prescription. Yun yung sinasabi dito. Halimbawa, siguro naging beneficial na, ganyan, nag-perform na, kaya lang sa kanya lang or sa iba lang nag-perform. Sinasabi dito na that act of one creditor is sufficient na. Sa pangalawang view naman, sinasabi naman dito, the act of a joint creditor which would ordinarily interrupt the period of prescription would not be valid because the indivisible character of the obligation requires collective action of the creditors to be effective. So, sinasabi nga natin dito, di ba, na kahit joint creditors or joint debtors, it is collective action. So, sinasabi dito na parang the obligation will only be effective kung magko-comply ang lahat, since it is collective action nga. And sinasabi dito na sa dalawang views, the latter is more logical. 'Di ba? Kasi sinasabi natin na joint indivisible obligation ay nape-perform lang, nagiging effective lang once nag-comply lahat ng debtors, lahat ng joint debtors. And i-perform lang din or na-enforce ang joint indivisible obligation kapag ang creditors ay naka-receive ng lahat ng creditors ay naka-receive ng kani-kanilang shares. Okay? So, it is on collective action. So, sinasabi sa second view na the act of one is not sufficient since joint indivisible obligation is a collective action. It requires collective action. Okay? Now, to summarize it all up, dito sa Article 1209, we are talking about joint indivisible obligation. Pag sinabi natin joint, we are talking about the parties involved. The parties are joint, okay? The parties are merely proportionately liable. Pag sinabi naman natin indivisible, we are talking about the object or the prestation due. The object or the prestation is not possible for any division. That's all for Article 1209. Again, Article 1209, if the division is impossible, the right of the creditors may be prejudiced only by their collective acts, and the debt can be enforced only by proceeding against all the debtors. If one of the latter should be insolvent, the other shall not be liable for his share. Thank you.